We spend trillions and trillions of dollars across state and federal governments on regulators, on projects that help this industry group or that industry group. And even just slowing the growth rate of those would make a tremendous difference over generations.
Hello, welcome again to another episode of the Let People Prosper show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to bring on someone who knows a lot about the budget and the federal level, has also worked a lot on taxes and tax reforms, and has kept his thumb on what's happening across the country in many ways. And it's none other than Richard Stern. Richard, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to be here today and talk.
Awesome. I'm excited to have you on too. We've chatted a while on social media. We've met a few times at different events. And so I'm glad to have you on and us to have this discussion here today. I'm really been looking forward to it. But before we get into all that fun stuff, let me read your bio for the audience and then we'll jump right into it. So Richard Stern is a director of the Grover M. Hermann Center for the Federal Budget at the Heritage Foundation. Prior to joining Heritage, Stern was a congressional staffer for over 7 years. During that time, he served as a policy staffer for the Republican Study Committee, where he was the staff lead for their budget and spending task force and spearheaded their work to create their fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2022 federal budgets. He also served as legislative director for Representative Tom McClintock of California and was a legislative assistant for former Representative Steve King of Iowa. Stern is a graduate of Emory University and holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics. So, with all that great stuff going on, Richard, let me go ahead and ask you the first question I do every guest. Why do you do what you do every day?
Well, so I really feel called to serve, to actually help people prosper, which I appreciate you always care so much about.
Yes.
And, it's one of those where I come from a family of engineers. And so I got instilled in me early the idea to try to understand how things work and try to use that knowledge to make people's lives better. And where a lot of my family do mechanical, computer engineering, I found that in public service in trying to make sure we've got policies that allow people to really flourish. And I still feel that calling. I feel passionate about it. And I've been glad to be able to be in the world that we're both in, where we've actually been able to see some of those things get done and see people build amazing businesses and communities out of it. So I love doing that, and that's why I get up every day and do these things.
Oh, I love it. That's good. What about with your economics part of things and getting into that area? What got you interested in it? Are there certain economists or books maybe that help lead you in giving your kind of thoughts that you have today? And maybe even more broadly, kind of what is your worldview of the world that we're in?
No, absolutely. So I'll tell you something that's going to sound shocking at first. I grew up in largely an agnostic, atheistic family.
Okay.
I actually grew up as a liberal. And so what happened for me, though, was as I said, family of engineers, which gave me an appreciation for trying to understand how things work. And kind of out of that, I as a young kid, I liked history. I wanted to understand how societies worked and civilizations worked. And my goal, much like most, misaligned communists, was I wanted to see people be empowered.
Yeah.
And of course, if you're raised in a liberal circumstance, you think that means heavy government that forcibly empowers people. And, the more I studied history, and actually the more I studied physics, I came to realize that a lot of it felt like resource fights to me.
Yeah.
And squabbles over what's possible, which is a lot of what technology unlocks. And that got me interested in economics.
Wow.
And as I got into economics, what I came to realize was, so and actually my major was in econ, but my minor was in physics.
Okay.
And I was talking to one of my professors at one point in college. We were talking about the Phillips curve, right?
Yeah.
This dreaded relationship between unemployment and inflation. And I did the analysis myself, and I had a shotgun scatter plot where there's no relationship between inflation and unemployment. And I went to the teacher and I said, "Where is the curve?" And he said, "Well, the curve moves."
Okay.
And I said back, "Or it just doesn't exist, right?"
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, no, we have the theory on it." But I'll tell you that the thing I said to him was, I was like, "Look, I have no idea whether the economics is right or wrong about this, but I'm telling you right now, the physics is wrong. Stuff just can't come from nowhere." And that honestly led to me to open the door to read Hayek, and understand how information works through prices, and Friedman, and do the walk that so many of us have done away from liberalism and towards a real understanding of how things work. So
Wow.
a little bit in a nutshell, it's kind of how I got to where I am. Right?
Nice, man. No, I didn't know all that. So that's fantastic. And so at that point in time, like being agnostic or atheist or something, would you have also considered yourself agnostic or atheist at that time too?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So actually, I'd say, so for me, my journey to conservatism, my journey towards being passionate about free markets and free trade, is something that came out of my finding of religion. So the joke I have right now is, it's important that we're not just free market, but that we're also invisible hand, that we see the merger of the two, as Adam Smith talked about. So, growing up that way, you have this kind of very cold sense of the world is just existing, that there's no rhyme or reason or goodness to it. And in that world, central planning makes sense because there is no authority figure.
Yeah.
But as I came through, frankly, science and other things to see the hand of an architect, you get this real notion that there is a real architecture, that there's right and wrong, that there's a path there.
Yeah.
And I actually view free markets as a way of uncovering that information, the way Hayek talked about. And so I actually view government and government intervention in the market as a man-made barrier that actually literally gets in the way between God and societies and gets in the way of that knowledge transfer from creation to all of us.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of my journey actually towards seeing the architect, becoming religious, and seeing free markets as a way of connecting actually closer with God.
Yeah. Wow. No, I like this. I like this a lot actually. And I think it actually explains quite a bit of my thinking as well, as far as where the government comes in. I mean, ultimately, the ruler or the one who's the omniscient being is God. It's not government, because it seems like too often people have turned to government as being the capital G God compared to being government. And those politicians, kind of, you get Buchanan's work on public choice, are rational. It's just that they have a different set of marginal cost and marginal benefits because they also need to be reelected. And that can lead them astray from their principles. And we see that sometimes. And I also think that there's something to where God said we should be fruitful and multiply, and I think that kind of gave us a calling to help others, to work, to populate, the world and things of that nature. And what better way to do that than through the lens of economics, but in a match of religion. I think sometimes maybe some economists get too caught up in the numbers and everything else that's going on. But I kind of fall into the line of thinking that God gave us a view of his world to understand it and how human behavior interacts together. And it's something beautiful to me that just kind of was eye-opening. My first one was really like capitalism and freedom, I'll admit, with Milton Friedman, because I grew up, my parents we were a Christian family and we went to Assembly of God. So it was really into it. But they didn't vote. Like, my parents didn't talk about politics. They didn't talk about policy. My dad, he had epilepsy, and anyway, he was on disability. My mom didn't graduate 10th grade. Like, she dropped out of school. And so there wasn't really that side of things, but there was always this idea that, look, God's helping us out in this direction, and there's prayer and there's other things that are going on. And as I started studying economics more later, I was like, okay, this starts to make more sense of the world. And so anyway, I love the way that you put that together. I don't know if you have anything else to say on that, but how else can that help you with your other sort of policy approaches that you look at from having that as a background, which I think is a great way to look at it?
No, thank you. And I appreciate your story as well. That story of coming to see these things and trying to make the best of what you've got in the world around you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of that came to this. I had this sense, I think a lot of people do, as you point out, that government is some, a set of elite people who know what's going on. We tend to think of government as being filled with Olympian gods, and you and I both know it's very far from that.
Yeah.
I'll tell you one other story that helped shape me a little bit in this as well. So when I was in college, I was in the student government, and at the time, of course, I was Democrat. I voted liberal, and in the student government, one of the major tasks we had was they made every kid, I think, go into debt $1,000 to pay an activity fee, which was money the student government allotted to clubs at the school, and it was our job as these kids on the student government to decide which clubs got the money or not.
Wow.
Literally, government choosing winners and losers.
Yeah.
So most of the people there, of course, are Democrats. They're used to me as being an active Democrat on campus. And I'm saying, whoa. Who are we to force these kids to go into debt? Who are we that choose which clubs get it? So I'm saying, no, we should have a voucher program. Let the students choose which clubs they want to fund. I was like, heck, we should give this money back to them.
Yeah.
And so the 3 Republicans on the student government looked at me and were like, where have you been for the last months here? Well, we've been talking about real politics. But to your point, right? It didn't really occur to me at the time that there was this gap. I understood that the student government I was on, I understood that I was the last person you wanted making that decision.
Yeah.
And same with my colleagues. But I still had this worshiping view, the way you're talking about. I still viewed DC government, right, as somehow being this Mount Olympus.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. People don't see that, and it's hard. And they think of government as just conferring free benefits. And, to your point, that again, one of the things that really just flipped the switch for me was reading Hayek about prices as a way of conveying information so that we can each figure out a way to be of service to each other and coordinate that work. The famous iPencil story, of course, is the culmination of that. But so that's a little bit more of, kind of the way I got into it, what I see. And I think to your point, what's so magical, frankly, about the way that markets work to allow each of us to maximize the service we render for each other.
Yeah. It's beautiful. It's one of the reasons why, I named my show "Let People Prosper." Is I played in a rock band during my late teen years, and I was in a hard rock band. I used to dye my hair black and have 10-gauge earrings in both ears. And anyway, I was living the rock star life. We'll just put it that way. And I got in a really bad car accident. We rolled 6 times, and we were young, stupid, and we were racing another car going 120 miles an hour. And I got a life flight at Hermann Hospital. And by the grace of God, that night, I went home and had about a month where I was bruised up overall. And it gave me some time to think about and pray about where my life is heading. And it was not in a good direction. And I felt, that's when I felt compelled to let people prosper, where I decided, okay, I'm going to go to college. I had never really thought about that. I'm going to go to college, get a PhD in economics at some point, go work in the White House in the Situation Room, and then now have my own business and doing all these things. But to your, these ideas of anchors or institutional changes in our lives, and thinking about Hayek. So Hayek's one of my favorite economists. It's really Milton Friedman, Hayek, Buchanan, and Lev von Mises, Thomas Sowell. Those are some of my favorites. And but also Douglas North with institutional economics and how things change over time. I don't know, man. It just kind of fits in there so well within religion, within the economy and society. And I see too often today that government has brought itself too much into the economy, to where if you think about healthcare and education, I mean, the vast majority of those dollars are going through government. They're controlling a lot of those sectors of the economy. And we wonder why we have kind of a breakdown of the family, or wonder why we have issues with our, certain areas of the economy or poverty. And I think a lot of it, from my view, and I'd love to get yours, is I think a lot of it comes from government. and what happened before government, there were still some problems, sure, but it seems like it doubles down on some of those. But what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. I think you hit the nail right on the head on that one. One of the stories I always tell people is Exodus, right? There's kind of 2 critical, I think, foundational things going on in Exodus. And one of them, and the one that most people focus on, is, of course, leaving Egypt, going into the wilderness. But the first part of that is actually that you have a group of people that come in who have a culture, who have a tradition, who have a sense of themselves, and morality, a connection with God, who lose all of it because they're enslaved, which is really to say that they have lost their agency, that they have a government that is oppressive to the 100% level. And in the presence of a government that consumes every aspect of their identity, of their agency, of their lives, it means that all of those cultural attributes atrophy.
Wow.
And that you lose all of your sense at an individual and a family and a community level of those societal fabrics and those institutions. And I think that's one of the crystal clear messages of Exodus, is that in some ways, the larger the government is, the smaller the community is, the smaller the family is.
Yeah.
And of course, the way that God whips the Israelites back into shape is he throws them into the wilderness. It is supply and demand interactions, it's scarcity writ large without a government filter that allows creation to mold them back into fighting trim, right? And
Yeah.
and I think both parts of that are in Exodus from such a beautiful capture of this process, right? We would be weary of large government and embrace the market, right? Embrace that ability for people to try on their own, to prosper, but also to reap the consequences of their bad decisions as well.
Yeah. Well, no, and that's just a really good point there is that most people want success, and I want everybody to succeed, but through my failures, I've learned a lot. And I think the more that we keep people from failing or something along those lines, the less we're going to learn, right? And then the less that we're going to be as prosperous as otherwise, because you got to learn from those mistakes. And speaking of not necessarily mistakes, but things you learn from, you did work in government for a while and doing different things. And I wonder, what did you learn about that experience before you got to Heritage? And then we'll talk about that in a minute too.
Yeah. So I'll tell you, and I tell people, ask me this all the time, because as you point out, I was on the Hill for 7 years.
Yeah.
And people ask me the question, what was the biggest shock, right? Coming from not on the Hill to come to the Hill. I'm going to sound like a nerd on this one, but my biggest shock was I thought that politics was about policy.
Yeah.
I really didn't understand how much of it was politics.
Yeah.
And I really didn't understand how much of it was trying to communicate across people and trying to sew up gaps between the way you think about something and the way somebody else thinks about it, and bridging that gap to communicate an idea and a concept, not just the words.
Mm-hmm.
And it changes everything about the nature of the relationships there. And it really opened my eyes to what we're talking about here, that the people in government are people.
Yeah.
They're not blessed with some amazing knowledge. They don't know better than you how to run your life.
Yeah.
But there's a quote that I always love. It's from Oliver Wendell Holmes, which is, he said that words are not crystal and transparent. They're the skin of a living thought. And I ran headlong into all parts of that on the Hill, that a word means one thing to you, it doesn't mean to somebody else.
Yeah.
That there's these concepts under the surface that words are a crude capture of, and you're trying to convey the deeper thing, but you have a poor medium for it. And politics, I think, in many ways is the art of trying to figure out how to convey that underlying concept while not actually having the tools to do it. It makes you more humble as well about policy implications, what we can assume, what we can control, and really even what's being communicated and what things are signaling and how that impacts culture. So, those are kind of the things I think I took away from my time on the Hill, was a humbler experience about understanding really where the focus is and how hard it really is to do that.
Yeah, no, it's wild that you brought that up, because I had the same situation. Like when I went to the White House as chief economist for the Office of Management and Budget, I'm like, oh man, I get to go work in the White House. It's going to be amazing and everything else. And I remember the first couple of months for me were really tough, to where I remember asking my direct report at the time, I was like, hey, should I be looking for another job? Because I mean, I thought it was going to be more policy, because that's where I was. That's who I am, an academic and policy person. And it was much more about the information that you can gain and the information that you can share. Going back to Hayek, there's not prices. The prices that you're paying in politics really are the words and the knowledge that you have and that you're able to glean from other people. And so sometimes that doesn't transfer very well, given that you don't have that profit and loss sort of mechanism. But then after that, probably to your point too, you probably had some days where you were down about it, but you know what? I think God puts us in those situations for that time, and you overcome it and you keep moving, right?
I think you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah.
And you brought up earlier, I had a bad car accident in college as well. And it is interesting.
Yeah.
Right. How for both, but you and I are both here today, fortunately. Right.
Right.
But yeah, you have all these moments where you can see providence coming into your life. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, but always, to your point, always guiding you towards a better understanding of things. And
yes,
what you're saying as well. I one of the similar experiences I had on the Hill is, you're right. It's the Hill itself is a failed market.
Yeah,
because there's no real price signal, which I actually think one of the more harmful things, maybe even in politics, is if you spend your life and your career there, you really don't have access to price signals that really shape you in a proper direction.
Yeah.
And so I think it's actually easier to indulge the idea that you should have government central planning, because if you assume the rest of the world looks like the really, chaotic environment of politics, I could see why they think that you need central planning. It's just, but it's one of those inside baseball things. If you're not there, you don't see it that way.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Oh man, that's really good. I like that a lot. All right. Well, we went through a lot of different worldview and philosophy and different things. This has been great. Let's start getting into some more of the policy areas. And at Heritage, where you're at, you work a lot on budgets and taxes and everything else. And what are some of the other issues that you really care about, or that you're working on mostly at Heritage? And how's that experience been for you so far?
Yeah, I've loved being at Heritage. It's right in the thick of it. Our offices are right off Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
And you're right. Right now, my main focus, right, is reconciliation, the opportunities we've got to really cut spending, to finally right-size the government or get towards it, right? Yeah. And then extend the tax cuts, but actually get more of those pro-growth tax cuts done. There's also a nexus with actually getting rid of regulations. Again, I think we all talk about this a lot, but a lot of that government spending is 10, 100 times worse than it looks like, because it's funding regulators.
Yes.
And I actually, we had a panel here at Heritage yesterday on deregulation that I was able to moderate. And I led by saying, we talk about taxes and deficits and their burdens on people, but I said that they're largely taxes on things that exist. Regulations are largely taxes on things that have yet to come to existence.
Yeah.
And that they are theft from what could have been.
That's a good point.
And so I think it's crucial, right, that while we're dealing with tax and spending policy and reconciliation, we try as much as possible to dismantle the regulatory state while doing that. And then, of course, everybody's favorite thing right now, tariffs and trade policy. That's the other thing that, of course, is gone from 0 to 100 in my world, right, pretty quickly.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. And it's interesting, too, because, if you think about it over time, like even in 2019, when I was at the White House writing the last budget, the budget I think we were looking at was $4.5 trillion, 4.6 trillion. And now we're up close to $7 trillion at the federal level. We're running massive deficits. And even then in the Trump White House, I was always pushing for us to cut spending more. I was like, look, we need president to be out there talking about reining in government spending then. And that's when we were running $500 or $600 billion deficits. Now we're running $2 trillion a year deficits, even after COVID and everything else. And it's like, man, how can we start to rein some of this back in? And maybe there's a chance of this reconciliation. I know that there's differing views, and the Trump tax cuts, at least the individual ones, and some of the other business ones will expire at the end of the year. Not the corporate tax rate of 21%. But those expire at the end of this year. So that brings a lot of uncertainty. And one of the issues that I've been working on, Richard, here recently, like thinking through the process and talking about on my podcast and other things, is the uncertainty piece is something that I think is, I don't know, when I talk to business owners and stuff, this seems to be something that they're really worried about. For the last 5 years, really, you had COVID and how long it was going to take for the economies to open up. And then we had inflationary pressures of what's the cost going to be. And now we have a situation where we not only have the Trump tax cuts expiring at the end of the year, what's that going to do to consumption and investment opportunities? But then you have the trade situation as well. And I wonder how, it's kind of it's a big question in some sense, but how do you like to break some of this down to say, okay, here's where we should start. and you take it however way you want. But how can we start to think about these in a way that can allow for what I think we all want is pro-growth policies that's going to let people prosper and hopefully bring down the deficit? What are you thinking about this, Richard?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the way I would start with, and this goes back to the wisdom of Milton Friedman.
Yeah.
He talked about that the true total burden of government is the spending, not taxes, not deficits, spending.
Yeah.
And the way that I try to say that, I try to convince people of it, right, is to say that, government spending represents the government's taking and repurposing of the products of Americans, that we all work hard to produce things that we hope are of value to everybody else. And when the government spends money, it's stealing that money and stealing the resources.
Yeah.
So then the question is, what does the government do with that? And of course, to the extent that the government is making investment decisions, they're going to be much less efficient than the rest of us, which means less prosperity, lower wages, et cetera, higher prices. To the extent that the government is just redistributing the wealth, we all would view that as mostly a moral thing. And to the extent that the government is choosing winners and losers and playing favorites, is rewarding donors of politicians, of course these are bad things. So when you look down the line, I think the real enemy here is a lot of people think of the government as just being able to create stuff for free. That the government descends down, gives you money, and you can go buy things. And that's the end of the story. They don't get the trade-off part.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the important things for economists, of course, is we understand it's not, a lot of people hate us, right? Because they say, well, why are you bringing trade-offs to the conversation?
Right.
We were having such a fun free lunch conversation before that.
Yeah.
And our job is to say, it's not that I'm bringing the trade-offs. Nature itself requires a trade-off.
Mm-hmm.
We're here to merely say, look, the trade-off either happens whether you acknowledge it or you don't.
Yeah.
And that's the thing about spending, is we need to get people to understand that it's always a trade-off, that it is always government theft and repurposing before government can maybe do something you would support. And I think if we can get people to see that, we can tackle some of these spending things. I mean, obviously, there's work requirements on the table. There are formulas. I think, interestingly enough, Medicaid rewards almost twice as much, money spent on able-bodied adults without kids as it does on people who are elderly or have disabilities or are working parents. Something that anybody would say that's unreasonable.
Yeah.
But yet it has been so hard to get Congress to even do that or make sure there's good work requirements. But, the other part of that, of course, is we spend trillions and trillions of dollars across state and federal governments on regulators, on projects that help this industry group or that industry group. And even just slowing the growth rate of those would make a tremendous difference over generations. So that's the way I always start into it, right? Is to say to people, at the end of the day, the pro-growth policy is to shrink government's control over our lives.
Yeah.
And you got to do it by paring down the spending.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, you're definitely singing my tune, because I feel the same way. I think that spending, I remember when I would teach interns or teach at economics in class and different things, is, which comes first, the chicken or the egg sort of approach on government spending versus taxes and, in that sort of thing. But I always like to break it down this way. And I love the way you did. I wonder what you think about this is, you had demands from people who said, you know what, I'm not getting exactly what I want out of the private sector. We want to preserve our rights. We want to do this, that, and other. It's hard for me to band together a private militia, because once a private militia comes and then another one comes and then you fight and then you have all these other sort of transaction costs along the way that Michael Munger likes to talk about a lot. And so you create a government, a national defense, let's say, or security. Then you have people that are going to need to fund the government or are going to run those programs. So they have salaries and stuff. And so to me, it's always been that the prime mover has really been the government spending. It's kind of the demands by the voters to put this in place, especially in a republic like we have. But then you think about what's the least burdensome form of taxation in order to fund that government spending. And those are some of the areas where I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, is that we're spending too much, yes, but we're also doing it in a way that, it's burdensome to income and labor and productivity and savings and investment. And so in many ways, we are crowding out the productive private sector, not only from the government spending, which is doing it, to your point, about reallocating resources and redistributing it in places that the marketplace isn't putting it. So there's a cost there, both direct and indirect cost. But then there's also this idea that we're taxing them in a bad way as well, which is hurting the economy. And so it's kind of like this double whammy on people. And so I'm hopeful, Richard, is that through this discussion, and I've been more hopeful than I have in a while in the spending, because we're starting to talk more about it. You have Elon Musk with Doge and coming up with these like wasteful uses of taxpayer money. And so exposing that, I think, has really been really big. I think President Trump has also been talking about the budget and spending more than he did during the entire 4 years of the first term. And so a lot of these things in states, by the way, are also moving a lot in this direction, which I think is helpful. But maybe we are at a point in time where we could see some major reforms there and then allow for the tax code to also be improved. So how can we start to piece some of that together as well?
I think you're absolutely right about that. And I've been encouraged as well. And, if you do budget policy for a long enough time, you never get encouraged.
Yeah.
But, I think one of the key things that's changed, that's been interesting, is for a very long time, we would talk about government spending as just, repurposing this or giving government power. What's happened recently, and part of this is through COVID and the lockdowns, is people are seeing government spending a little bit, not as just redistributing resources, but as funding woke stuff, as funding, attacks on Western values, on churches. as funding these regulators.
Yeah.
And, a lot of the school choice movement, right, has been this real recognition that it's money stolen from you to fund woke schools teaching, utter crap to kids.
Yeah.
And so they're learning not just nothing, but they're learning counterproductive things.
Yeah.
And so it's that kind of understanding from people that's not just government, repurposing wealth, but government changing values, attacking cultural institutions that I think has brought people over and has paved the way for Doge, for what Trump's talked about. So I actually think the more we lean into that, I think the better. The more that people don't just see government spending as dollars, but the more that they see it, frankly, as the way as economists we do, as a threat to your way of life.
Yeah.
Cultural, perhaps, as opposed to material. It helps to build that robust bulwark of people who see government spending as not the way forward.
Yeah.
And then on the tax side of it, I think you're absolutely right. And, the simple way I talk to people about it is I say, look, a lot of people think about tax policy as who do I want to have file taxes? And so they're thinking of, I want Jeff Bezos. They're like, I want his yacht. Can we tax that?
Yeah.
But what people don't really think about a lot is, whoever files the tax is not really the person who carries the burden of the tax. And so people are looking at a lens of who's writing the check. They're not really thinking of where does the check come from. And, the classic, of course, from businesses, and this is, again, Friedman, right? Corporations don't pay taxes. It's either the investors who do, which means that they'll have less money to hand counterintuitively to startup businesses. Right. One thing I always love telling people is, dividends really are money leaving old monopolistic firms and ending up in the hands of home buyers and small and startup businesses.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But, then otherwise it's consumers and workers who pay the burden of those taxes. So I think if we can get people into a mindset of thinking about not who's writing the check for the tax bill, but who feels the burden of the tax bill, then you can start to open up these real conversations. How do we really get to simple, clean-cut, straightforward pro-growth tax policy? But it's about shifting your perspective on who we're taxing and why we're taxing.
Yep. No, great point. What do you think about what the discussion right now? We have the reconciliation. We've got at least the framework of what can be done. Do you think we'll get to a place where we can get permanence of most of the individual tax rates, or how are you seeing what's going on up there right now?
So I think it's a good down payment. There's a lot of spending cuts that would have to happen, which I think is pushing forward. And the more we can give Congress a backbone to do that, the better.
Yeah.
On the tax side of it, I'll tell you one thing that we've been focused on. I've been trying to shout from the rooftops.
Yeah.
Is that there's really two different tax bills all merged as one. There's some cuts that are nice, but they're trading off between deficits and personal cuts. And then there's this massive reform that was done with the tax code that is actually pretty close to balance. The truth is, you can do all the expensing provisions for business, which are part of that pro-growth, of course, that we're talking about. And you can do QBID. And look, QBID's not the best program, but it's important to a lot of members of Congress. It is a boon to small businesses. But you can do QBID, 190A, pass-through deduction, the expensing provisions. You can make permanent the much higher standard deductions, the double child tax credit, a bunch of these other provisions in exchange for getting rid of these special interest carve-outs that have been the itemized deductions. You could make that permanent tomorrow like that, and it only takes about $500-600 billion of deficits during the 10-year window, but they're in fact balanced and have increasing surpluses after the 10-year mark.
I see. Yeah.
What we're really debating is these other just rate cuts on top of that don't have as much pro-growth value, but obviously let people keep the money they earn.
Yeah.
That's the part that the deficits are coming from.
I see.
And so the way that I've been looking at it is I think, the part of this where it's a few $100 billion as a little debt bubble in the middle to get permanence on this grand reform that's pro-growth and simpler and helps middle-class families, we should just do that.
Yeah.
And the spending cuts we should use to pay for these a multi-year extension of the rate cuts. And we could buy 4, 5, 6 years of rate cuts if we get the spending cuts that Congress thinks it can do. And I think that's really the right approach. Make permanent the grand reform that everybody cares about, and then buy years of extensions on the rate cuts as Congress is willing to cut that spending and actually shrink the burden of government. So that's a way that I've been thinking through it, and we've been looking at it at the Heritage Foundation.
Nice. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And that will also help out with the uncertainty that we were talking about earlier. You start to price that in the marketplace. And so that will help out with investment and savings and everything else. So I think that will be really good. And I'm with you. I hope that they can do something on the spending side, to make sure that's a big focus. And we may differ on this. I don't know, but like, I'm not a complete supply side economist. I consider myself a free market economist, where I do believe that there are incentive effects that happen whenever you change taxes. Don't get me wrong. Like, people want to work more and everything else, but what I've seen happen over time, and I think theoretically there's an argument for this as well, is that at least in the short run, you are going to see a deficit if you keep spending the way that you're spending before. And that's what we saw during JFK, during Reagan. The only one who really didn't do this was Coolidge back, 100 years ago, which I wish we could do some more of that. But that's the problem I see, is that we keep running these deficits early on, and you do get. I do think that there's an argument that the Trump sort of policy proposals or approaches and pro-growth policies of the first administration helped pay for, quote unquote, pay for the tax cuts, because the deregulation was huge. It allowed for so much more economic growth, plus the corporate tax rate going down to 21%. What I'm a little concerned about right now, though, Richard, is that extending the Trump tax cuts isn't necessarily pro-growth relative to where we're at now, unless we have more certainty, and it allows for those changes to be like, okay, now I can plan, so now I'll make those actions. What do you think about that? Is that something you follow along with it too, or push back on me if you want?
No, I think you're absolutely right about that. But again, I guess what I would say is, TCJ the first time raised taxes by not quite $4.5 trillion, and then cut taxes by not quite $6 trillion. So you had $1.5 trillion net tax cut, but it was closing a lot of loopholes.
Yeah,
getting rid of a lot of special interest carve-outs,
like SALT deduction and stuff like that.
Precisely, right?
Yeah.
And I think again here, right, really most of the tax provisions that anybody cares about together as a package don't produce deficits, right? It's a few $100 billion over 10 years.
Yeah.
But it's transitioning to where you've got no deficit past year 10. That to me is a gold mine, because to your point, it's not the most amazing pro-growth thing, but that actually gives you basically all the pro-growth features and the pro-growth of simplifying the tax code. And not wasting resources on tax prep and everything else. Yeah. And you can do that while basically not running deficits, because it's a clean reform that is getting rid of these special interest things, going to simplified good policies. And then I think your point's exactly right on the rate cuts. That's a lot of deficits, very counterproductive deficits for tax policy that itself is not terribly pro-growth. Yeah. Which is really to say that you're just shifting the distribution of burden between taxes and deficits. So taxes are bad for the people who pay them, but deficits mean higher interest rates, higher inflation rates, boxing people out of capital markets. People won't be able to buy homes or build small businesses or get a degree or a trade certificate. And so, that's insidious as well, right? And so I think the important thing, to your point, is there's this handful of reforms we can do that are good, that are pro-growth, make those permanent. Don't hold those hostage to things that frankly are not worth the deficits. Yeah. And exactly to your point, if we can't cut the spending, then we have no business doing things that are simply just sloppily redistributing the burden of that spending. We got to go after the spending and of course the regulations. And I'll tell you as well, I think REINS Act has come up a lot, regulatory budgeting's come up a lot. We have to do this. There's a comfort level in talking about tax and spending policy precisely because we have scorekeeping on it. Regs are a wild west. No one has really good data on exactly what the cost is or the value or there's no CBO score of reg. It's the part of the iceberg that's under the water. Yeah. Yeah. And so, the more we can do to put a spotlight on that, to go after it, to dismantle it, I agree with you. The sky's the limit as to what people can do for themselves to create that prosperity.
Yeah. Amen. All right, so we have that. So we have the spending side, and I hope we get to a spending limit someday and allow for slowing down the growth rate. I think that will help with uncertainty and less theft, less taken out of the productive private sector. And then we can move to a more, I hope a more consumption-based income tax if we're going to have it, or a consumption tax. I hope we can move more in that direction. but that's probably a little ways off. But I do feel like, or I not feel, but I believe that we need to be focused on spending restraint, and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act would be made permanent. But unfortunately, at least from my view, we haven't started there. The Trump administration has focused more on trade and protectionism and tariffs and things of that nature. And I think, from their perspective, and there was a lot of this in the first administration too, is that we've got to help out the Rust Belt. We've got to help out manufacturing. We've been taken advantage of for so long. These other countries have tariffs, and and I've shared my views on this for a number of times. But I think that from some perspective, that this is the way maybe to go first, and then we'll get the Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts and other things. I wish they would have done it the opposite way. I wish we would have had the growth and the certainty, and get that out there first, and then do some of this stuff, because now it starts to rain. It takes a lot of air out of the discussion we could be having about the tax cuts. But I wanted to get your perspective on this, because I've learned a lot from you, talking to you, and we're in some chats together and different things, but kind of about this border adjustment tax. So I kind of wanted to get your thoughts, Richard, on like tariffs and the trade, but how the BAT may be a better approach in your view to go down that route.
And I appreciate the time to talk about it. Yeah. We've been in some fun conversations, ranging on all this stuff, right? So I think one of the important things that's kind of going on under the hood that's important for everyone to really realize is that there's at least 2 different or 3 different trade conversations going on all across each other. There's a group of people who genuinely want to get rid of trade barriers abroad, expand markets for U.S. exports, get rid of quotas and other things that are, special interest carve-outs abroad that have impacted our manufacturers. There's another element of people that want to use trade to box China out of not just our supply chains, but that of every country that we trade with and that whose supply chains run through us. Then there's this third camp, as you brought up, which are the protectionists. Yeah. And I think, you and I could go for hours on this one, but the protectionist argument makes no sense. Yeah. And it's a poverty mindset for America. Mm-hmm. The 2 other ones are very important, though, right? There are real trade barriers that are good to get rid of. There is a real question about China. And what I would tell you is there's very obvious national security concerns about China and about China dumping technologies into the U.S., stealing our technology. But there's also just an economic uncertainty. I think one of the interesting things is if you look at U.S. imports of Chinese goods as a share of U.S. GDP, it's actually been cut almost in half in 11 years. We now know that a full third of Chinese companies are unprofitable. We know that an enormous amount of their financial systems are based on physical assets that probably don't exist, or don't actually have the value they claim to do. Right. So, the global private sector has been kind of slowly backing away from China because they understand it's a bad market to be in, let alone the government's autocratic and oppressive practices, let alone the nefarious national security risks. Yeah. So I think part of what's important for all of us, for conservatives here, is to encourage the president and people like Treasury Secretary Percent to continue using tariffs as a way of getting short-term negotiations to get rid of trade barriers, to try to figure out what deals we can make with our allies and partners to work towards a future where China is removed from the picture, where we can reroute these supply chains through countries you can rely on. And I think those are important things. And it's important for us to nudge the conversation that way, nudge it away from protectionism, so that we can get productive use out of this. But I want to talk about the border adjustment tax for a second here. And I appreciate you bringing it up. So this had been something that originally Speaker Ryan and Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Kevin Brady, had put forward in the 2017 bill, which failed out of it. And I'll get to that in a second. But I want to start by addressing, so what is this underlying dealing with? Yeah. So you and I would both like to get the U.S. tax system to something called a consumption tax because it just works mechanically so much better to have a better, cleaner tax system. And actually, for all the things that so many countries around the world do wrong on a lot of things, perhaps the one thing that most of them have done right is they have shifted their tax systems over to consumption-based taxes. Now, not fully, but partially. The U.S. federal tax system is still purely an income tax. So at a very basic level, there's a mechanical imbalance between what they tax and what we tax. And at a very simple and purest level, In income tax, tax is where things come from. So if I make it here, it's taxed here. But a consumption tax, tax where it goes. So if I'm got an income tax and my trade partner has a consumption tax, then they can export to me and it doesn't see their consumption tax because it left their country, but it sees, and it does not see my income tax because it wasn't made here. So it passes through tax free. But if I make it here and sell it here, it's taxed. So taxed more than the import. And if I make it here and export it to a country with a sales tax, it's taxed here and it's taxed again under their consumption tax abroad. Now, currency markets try to rebalance to deal with this arbitrage. And they do, but you run into a situation where currency markets are an aggregate adjustment, not a specific tailored adjustment. So really, ultimately, the right way to do it is set up the U.S. tax system to work the way that theirs do. So we all can have a global consumption tax. So we only tax things where they go and don't tax them where they come from. And the kernel of truth, I think, to the people on the protectionist side is that tax imbalance has actually harmed, most likely, American manufacturers simply by virtue of leaving the U.S. tax system in an arcane manner and not modernizing it, not making it as efficient as the way everybody else's mechanical work. So very simply, a border adjustment tax is where you bring imports into taxation in the U.S., and you remove exports from taxation so that within the U.S., it's still the income tax. You and I can try to fix that later.
Yeah.
But as it comes to U.S. activities outside of our borders, it works like a consumption tax the way it does elsewhere. So the the border adjustment, doesn't stack with the income tax. It's that you have a consumption tax for stuff that happens abroad and an income tax for stuff that happens here. And part of what we've looked at the Heritage Foundation is, and I should say as well, part of what went wrong in 2017. Was they tried doing this BAT as an integrated part of the corporate tax, which meant that it was a full border adjustment at 20%, which, if you think of it this way, everyone we trade with has a mix of income and consumption taxes where we only have an income tax. So what you actually want is not a full border adjustment in the U.S. That would be overcorrecting for the problem.
I see. Yeah.
You actually want a half correction. You want something that corrects proportionate to what percentage of their taxes are income or consumption. So long story short on that is what they were offering was massive. And of course, there's always some transition. Currency markets have to revalue. It alters supply chains. A 20% just overnight reform is breathtaking. What we've actually looked at Heritage is you could do perhaps a 5% border adjustment and set it up as a separate mechanism of the border. So it looks like a universal 5% tax tariff on things coming in and a 5% credit on things going out the door. And the credit offsets that the corporate tax in the U.S. would still tax exports. So the credit offsets that tax burden. But at just 5% or maybe 7%, it's small enough to not destabilize current supply chains, but large enough to mostly correct this imbalance and is a really good revenue raiser that you can then use to make all these other pro-growth tax cuts permanent and extend them. And so that's what we've been looking at Heritage. This is a way of meeting the protectionist halfway, of addressing the real tax imbalance, doing it at a rate that's maybe 5 or 7%, something that's low enough that it actually is not broadly destabilizing to global supply chains. And then is this really good revenue raiser that we can use to cut other taxes that are much more harmful, maybe even get expensing for structures. Something that's been elusive in the tax world, So thank you for giving me the space here to kind of walk through all of that. But that's what we've been looking at, what I've been talking through people.
And it's different than a tariff in the sense that it's not just on the import side because there's a credit for when you're exporting as well. And it's also something, would that also be something that Congress would do versus the president having the opportunity to do that, right?
Precisely. And if that's part of our thought is, in fact, Dr. Kevin Roberts here at Heritage and I put an op-ed out saying that we'd like Congress to work with the president to convert his executive order across the board tariff in the reconciliation bill into this more sophisticated border adjustment mechanism.
Okay.
And I should point out as well, the part of why that works well to do both the tax on the import side, but the credit on the export side, is both of those push up the value of the dollar in a way that offsets the burden to Americans of redoing the tax system that way. So it gets rid of the imbalances, but it also gets rid of, frankly, an imbalance that exists in currency markets because of how bad our tax system is.
Yeah.
But one other point I'll make as well, it's important on this. One of the problems with a tariff, of course, is if you have industrial supply chain parts that move across the border multiple times, you can see the tariff multiple times. With a border adjustment, if you've got a car part that's moving across the border 4 or 5 times, it's a tariff in, credit out. And you can do that 20 times. And so actually, if you're looking at an intermediate product that is bouncing across the border multiple times, moving from factory to factory, you don't stack the tax on it.
I see.
The tax and the credit offset each other so that you ultimately have a credit if it's ultimately exported, or one tax if it's ultimately consumed in country. So
got it.
Works beautifully.
Yeah. So it is more like a final sales and use tax, sales tax.
Bingo.
Compared with others. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And what? Go ahead.
Oh, I was saying, the way I've been explaining it, it's a little bit like if you think of the U.S. tax system as having bad eyesight. Going to a consumption tax is like getting LASIK. But in the meantime, a border adjustment is like getting glasses to correct your vision that way, right?
Nice. Yeah. I guess my only concern, well, one is creating a new tax compared to what we have today. That's a concern. But, with this whole discussion about trade and the hollowing out of the Rust Belt and the trade deficits and whether or not they're a problem and everything, my concern is that we get too focused on the wrong side of the problem. Like my concern really is that if you think about the Rust Belt, there were union dues that were forced on people and raising minimum wages in a lot of the Rust Belt states that also had a lot of government spending and taxes and high regulations, along with the federal regulations. And so to me, those were government failure problems that we should try to adjust first, because what we saw was that a lot of those Rust Belt manufacturing spots, they would, or facilities, they would move to the Sun Belt, like Texas and other places in that area that didn't have a personal income tax, had lower regulations, less government spending, right to work laws. And so we saw some of that shift, but we also did see, of course, some of it did go to other countries like China and Mexico and other places because it was more profitable to do so. And so my kind of calculus here, Richard, is that how do we make sure that we're also, if we are going to attack on one side and try to correct some of these effects, which to be honest, I think that there are going to be more government failures by going in that direction compared to the other side. But let's say that they were able to solve it. Don't we still need to figure out how to solve some of these other problems on the backside to make sure that this problem doesn't perpetuate or make worse longer term?
Oh, absolutely. And I'll tell you, in the app that Dr. Robertson and I put out, what we said in there is, we appreciate the president's use of tariffs to break down these foreign abuses and barriers, but that while we're doing that, we would encourage Congress, partly in reconciliation, to work on getting rid of the domestic barriers, the impositions of, as I like to call it, the DC cartel, which is spending, the taxes, the regulations, the Fed destroying our currency, all of these things, right?
And the Fed.
But, exactly right. Exactly. But I think part of that, right, is I don't actually view these things as pitting against each other.
Okay.
I think we can do these at the same time. I think that, Doge is making popular the idea of cutting spending at the same time that a lot of the other movements that are going on in the conservative circles are making it popular to go after regulators. And at the same time that we have the push in Congress to cut taxes, to do things that are pro-growth. But as we were talking about earlier, there's a debate between the pro-growth and the non-pro-growth parts of the tax code. And cutting government spending. So in my mind, we can do all this together. In fact, I'll tell you the thing I think it would be harmful, right, is if you're talking to people who say to you, look, we need protectionism because we need to defend these industrial centers because of global tax and trade imbalances, they're right that there's a global tax imbalance. You and I would disagree with them about what the remedy is for that in full. But they're right that there is this tax imbalance existed for decades. Now, the fact that people like us have tried to push the U.S. tax system to become a consumption tax to get rid of that imbalance, they don't care.
Yeah.
So in my mind, right, the border adjustment mechanism is the perfect way to address a real tax imbalance. And in the same way that, salt, getting rid of the salt deduction is a tax increase on some people. You and I would both say these people were getting an outsized benefit.
Right.
But you and I wouldn't want to reduce the salt cap and then have the government keep the money.
Right.
We demand that money be used to cut other people's taxes.
Yeah.
Same thing for a border adjustment. In no way, shape, or form would we want a border adjustment tax to raise revenues. We would want it purely as an offset to cut other taxes, to cut taxes for middle-class families and small businesses to make it easier to take factory equipment and park it in the ground in the U.S. and get expensing for it.
Yeah.
So I think there's a world here where we can fix the real imbalance, use the BAT for that, use those revenues to cut other taxes, and have it be part of one grand conversation where we are all working together to deal with all of these components, both abroad and domestically, all at the same time. And I think we can push on that. And I'm actually afraid if we make these different parts of the coalition fight each other, we'll just lose the plot on all of it. So that's where I am.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I appreciate the conversation. And there are a lot of differing views that are out there these days. And I think, to be honest, I think we need more of these types of cordial discussions. And Kevin Roberts, of course, is a good friend of mine. And he was at TVP at Texas Public Policy Foundation when I was there. And, we still keep in touch. And so I'm always glad to talk with him and to you and learning along the way. I think this is a part of the going back full circle to what we talked about earlier of God's world, of what he's created for us and how we're trying to gain more knowledge of figuring out things. And us as economists, we're good about thinking about trade-offs and where that knowledge is going and different things. And this is a good time to be able to think about those to where we have big changes happening in DC, big changes happening across the country, and even globally. How can we best learn how to navigate ourselves personally, from our family, our businesses, but ultimately as a people? And if we treat people like people, I really think we can be headed in a better direction to let them prosper. And so I really appreciate all the work that you're doing, Richard. I'll make sure to put all of this in the show notes page, but I want to give you an opportunity too to say anything that we may have missed or anything you'd like to highlight before we go.
Well, thank you again for having me on. It's been a real pleasure. And I think you said all that quite beautifully. And at the end of the day, what I always tell people is economics is a walk of faith. You have faith. You could go live in a cabin in the woods by yourself and be totally self-sufficient, not have to rely on anybody else. But you have to do that at the expense of living not just in material poverty, but spiritual, societal, community poverty. All of this work, right, about balancing trade-offs, about trying to maximize freedom to prosper, is about having the faith that giving people that freedom will mean that people prosper materially and spiritually, and that we can build stronger communities from that. And what I always point out to people is these foundations of a free society in America, they didn't start in 1776.
No.
They started in 1621 at Plymouth. Right?
Yeah.
And then we had religious refugees coming to the U.S. to found a society devoted to human dignity, to respect for God-given rights, to God's law. And that's where these institutions of a free society came from. And we've seen the blessings of that. And I think it's important for us. I know you do amazing work in this, and I try to as well, to keep that flame alive, to keep that lesson alive for people. So thank you again for having me on.
Yeah, no, I just want to say amen to your points there. That was beautifully said. And anyway, keep up the great work, and God bless you and your family, Richard. And I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Likewise. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, for the audience, thank y'all for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. There's so many different things that are going on. Who else better to talk to us about than Richard? And so we really got into budgets and spending and tariffs and BATs and a whole bunch of other stuff. And so please share this with your friends and family. They too need to learn about these things. And remember, you can find more information at vanceginn.com or get my show notes and newsletter at vanceginn.substack.com. But until next time, God bless you and let people prosper.